Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales that touch the heart and remind us of the power of love, empathy, and second chances. Today, we bring you the story of Emily, a young woman forced into a life she never chose, marrying a man she barely knew. As she navigates through betrayal, hardship, and unexpected truths, Emily discovers the strength to find her own happiness. Join us as we dive into her journey of self-discovery, love, and the lessons life has to offer. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. In the small, tight-knit village nestled by the river, there was a story, one that began in sorrow and grew into something no one had expected. It was the story of Emily, a girl whose life seemed destined for hardship from the very beginning. Emily was born under the harshest of circumstances. Her mother, a young woman barely out of her teens, had died giving birth to her. The old midwife who had attended the delivery looked down at the tiny girl, wrapped in nothing more than a tattered cloth. "This child has no one," she murmured, her voice heavy with pity. The midwife had been ready to leave the baby to fate, to let her go without a name or a future. But just as she was about to turn away, a shadow appeared in the doorway. It was Margaret, a woman whose heart, though cold to many, held a quiet strength. "Give me the child," she said, her voice calm but firm. The midwife hesitated, unsure whether it was wise to place the child in the hands of a woman with a daughter already at home. "You already have Lily to care for," the midwife protested, but Margaret's gaze was unyielding. "Give me the child," she repeated, and so, the midwife handed Emily over, not knowing that this child, this fragile little girl, would one day become the source of Margaret's deepest regrets. Margaret named the baby Emily and took her back to the small, humble home where she already raised her biological daughter, Lily. It was a modest hut with a leaky roof and creaking walls. Yet it was where Margaret did her best to make a home. Emily grew up thinking that Margaret was her true mother, showering her with the kind of love a child craves. But that love came with a price. While Lily, Margaret's daughter, enjoyed playing with her friends, Emily spent her childhood doing the chores, cleaning, cooking, and running errands. As Emily grew, her beauty became impossible to ignore. Her smooth, dark skin seemed to glow under the sun. Her eyes sparkled with an undeniable brightness, and her long hair flowed like the rivers that ran near the village. People in the village began to gossip. "Is she really Margaret's daughter?" they would whisper. "She doesn't look like her at all." The villagers couldn't understand how a child with such beauty could belong to a woman like Margaret, whose hard, weathered features were a far cry from Emily's. Lily, once the center of attention in the village, now found herself overshadowed by Emily's radiance. She saw how the boys, even the wealthy merchant's son, looked at Emily and not her. A jealousy began to brew inside Lily's heart, a fire she couldn't put out. She couldn't bear to see her friends fawn over Emily, couldn't stand how her own mother seemed to praise Emily more than she ever did her. One evening, Emily, exhausted from a long day of work, overheard a conversation between Margaret and Lily. She was hiding behind the kitchen door, unable to tear herself away, as she heard the words that would shatter her heart. "She's not even your real daughter," Lily hissed, her voice sharp with bitterness. Emily's heart froze in her chest. "She's adopted, isn't she? That's why she's so different from us," Lily continued, her words venomous. "She doesn't belong here, Mama. She's just a burden." Margaret sighed heavily, a sound of resignation, of years of unspoken truths. "You're right," she muttered, her words cutting through the silence. "She was never mine. I should have left her that night." Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her chest, the weight of those words sinking deep into her soul. The woman she had loved, the woman she had called mother, had never truly wanted her. The realization hit her harder than anything she had ever experienced. Her life, her love, her trust had been a lie. From that moment on, everything changed. Margaret and Lily no longer tried to hide their disdain for Emily. She was no longer their daughter but a servant. She was expected to do all the hard work, while Lily spent her days outside, carefree. Emily ate scraps, while Lily enjoyed full meals. The bitterness between them grew, and Emily's heart sank deeper into loneliness. Her once bright spirit began to dim, crushed under the weight of rejection and neglect. But the cruelest blow came when Margaret called Emily into the house one morning with a cold, detached tone. "You're getting married," she said, her words sending a chill down Emily's spine. "Married to who?" Emily stammered, her breath catching in her throat. "To Ethan," Margaret replied, her voice flat, void of any warmth. Ethan was a poor fisherman, a man who lived on the edge of the village in a ramshackle hut. He was ridiculed by the villagers, known for his limp and his struggles to make ends meet. The thought of marrying him sent a wave of panic through Emily. Tears filled her eyes, but there was no one to turn to, no one to fight for her. "Please, Mama," Emily pleaded, her voice trembling. But Margaret's face remained stone cold. "Don't call me that. I should have thrown you away years ago," she snapped. "You're nothing to me now. You will marry Ethan, and you will leave this house. Do you understand?" Lily stood in the doorway, a wicked smile on her face, enjoying every moment of Emily's pain. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. She had no choice. Her future had already been decided for her. With no wedding dress, no celebration, and no family to support her, she was sent away to marry Ethan, a man the world mocked. But neither Margaret nor Lily knew the truth about Ethan. They had thrown Emily into the arms of a man they considered beneath them, not realizing that he was secretly a billionaire, a man whose wealth and power far surpassed anything the village could have imagined. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Ethan through the narrow, winding paths of the village. Her wedding day had been a blur. No dress, no joy, no celebration, only a cold, forced union with a man whom she barely knew. The village had whispered about Ethan, calling him useless and poor, a man who was nothing but a crippled fisherman. His small hut at the edge of the river was nothing more than a shack, and the villagers mocked him for his limp. Yet here she was, walking behind him, her feet dragging with the weight of her shame. When they reached his home, Emily's breath caught in her throat. The hut was as desolate as she had imagined, small, with a leaking roof, a creaky wooden bed, and nothing but damp wood and the smell of fish in the air. This was her new life, the life she had been forced into, and the harsh reality of it was suffocating. "This is your home now," Ethan said quietly, his voice soft but firm as he pointed to a thin mat on the floor. His words were kind, yet there was an unspoken sadness in them. Emily stared at the mat, disbelief settling in her bones. Was this really the life she was destined for? From Margaret's house to this? Was this all she was worth? As the night grew colder, Emily curled up on the mat, her body trembling not from the chill of the air, but from the coldness in her heart. She had cried herself to sleep many times before, but this was different. She felt utterly alone. The wind whistled through the cracks in the hut, echoing the emptiness in her soul. Her marriage had been a cruel joke, an exchange, nothing more than a transaction. She had been cast aside, forced into a life she never wanted, with no family to support her, no one to care for her. But then, as if the world had turned its back on her, Ethan did something unexpected. He did not demand his rights as a husband on their first night together. Instead, he quietly lay on the bed, turning his back to her, leaving her to the silence. Emily could barely believe what she was seeing. After everything, after being thrown away by Margaret, after being married off to this man, he did not treat her like the others had. He gave her space. He did not ask for anything in return. And for the first time, Emily felt something she hadn't known in years: peace. The next morning, when the village women gathered at the river, they continued their cruel gossip, eyeing Emily with sneers. They laughed and pointed, mocking her for marrying a man they considered beneath her. "Look at the rich man's daughter now, the wife of a beggar," one woman sneered, and the others joined in, laughing like hyenas. Emily lowered her head, her face burning with humiliation. She had always been the subject of gossip in Margaret's house. But this was worse. Then, as if the universe wanted to test her further, Lily appeared, dressed in fine clothes, her skin glowing with expensive oils. She stepped forward with a smirk on her face. "Sister, how's married life?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. Emily's fists clenched, but she kept her composure, refusing to let the tears fall. Lily stepped closer, whispering, "You should be grateful. At least someone wanted you. No man of status would ever marry an abandoned child like you." Emily felt the sting of her words deep in her chest, but she refused to let them break her. Without saying a word, she turned and walked away, the mocking laughter of Lily and the other women ringing in her ears. She spent the rest of the day by the river, staring at her reflection, wondering if they were right. Was she really nothing but a discarded child? Someone who didn't belong anywhere? But then something shifted. For the first time in her life, something deep inside her stirred, telling her that her fate was not as bleak as it seemed. She did not know what it was, but deep within her, a small flicker of hope ignited. She may not have had the life she had dreamed of, but she wasn't going to let it break her. Not yet. The days turned into weeks, and Emily learned to live with Ethan. Though they barely spoke to one another, she did what she could to make the house a home. She cleaned, cooked, and fetched water, all while Ethan kept to himself, focusing on his own tasks. It was not an easy life, nothing about it was, but it was better than the torment she had endured at Margaret's house. She found herself growing accustomed to the quiet, the stillness, and the simplicity of it all. One afternoon, as she struggled to carry a heavy basket of yams from the market, she tripped and spilled the yams everywhere. The village women laughed, shaking their heads at her. "Even as a poor man's wife, she's still useless," one woman muttered. Emily's face burned with embarrassment as she bent down to gather the yams. But before she could reach them, a strong hand reached out and helped her. She looked up in shock. It was Ethan. He picked up the yams without a word, handing her the basket. Emily expected him to mock her, just as everyone else did. But he didn't. Instead, he said softly, "You don't have to carry everything alone." For the first time, Emily felt something shift inside her. It wasn't much, but it was the first time anyone had ever offered her kindness without expecting anything in return. There was no cruelty, no judgment, just a simple act of empathy. As the days passed, Ethan's quiet kindness continued. He didn't ask for anything, didn't demand anything from her. And though Emily still struggled with the life she had been forced into, she couldn't help but notice that something in her was starting to heal. She still didn't know much about Ethan, but she knew that his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. For the first time, Emily felt safe, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to help her build the life she had once dreamed of. Weeks passed, and Emily continued to adjust to her new life with Ethan. Despite the hardships, she began to realize that life in Ethan's small hut was different from the misery she had endured at Margaret's house. Here, there was no cruelty or harsh words, though the poverty was evident in every corner of the small home. There was an undeniable sense of peace. For the first time in her life, Emily felt like she wasn't being watched, judged, or belittled. Ethan had his own struggles, yet he didn't project them onto her. Instead, he quietly shared what little he had, always with kindness. It wasn't an easy life, but it was hers, and that was enough. Emily no longer felt like the unwanted, discarded child she had once believed herself to be. But there was still something she couldn't shake, a sense that Ethan was hiding something from her. Something more than just his humble existence. There was a quiet strength in him that she couldn't quite understand. A mystery that lingered in the air whenever they were together. One afternoon, as Emily sat by the river, her mind wandered back to the conversations she had overheard back in the village. The whispers, the mockery from the villagers, how they had laughed at her, pitying her for marrying a man they considered to be beneath her. But none of it made sense. If Ethan was truly as poor as everyone said, why did he treat her so differently? Why was he so patient? So kind? The more Emily thought about it, the more questions arose. The turning point came one evening when Emily returned from the market. As she approached the hut, she saw something that made her pause in her tracks. Ethan was standing in the distance, talking to a few men from the village. She couldn't hear their conversation, but there was something about the way they were looking at him, respect, admiration, that made Emily's heart race. When he noticed her approaching, he immediately excused himself and walked toward her. Who were they? Emily asked, her voice tentative. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Ethan smiled softly, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. Just some men from the village, he said, his tone calm but distant. They were asking me for some help with a project. Emily's curiosity grew, but she didn't push him further. Ethan's guarded nature had always been a part of him, and she had learned not to question it too much. But that night, as they ate their simple meal together, Emily couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that something was being kept from her. The next morning, she woke up to a strange silence in the hut. Ethan was nowhere to be found. It wasn't unusual for him to be out early, but there was something different in the air. As the day wore on, Emily's unease grew. She hadn't seen Ethan all day, and his absence felt like an unspoken tension hanging over her. As the sun began to set, Emily ventured outside to search for him. She followed the path by the river, her mind racing with possibilities. When she rounded the corner, she saw him, standing in front of a large, iron gate. It was the kind of gate she had never seen before. Massive and imposing. The kind of gate that belonged to a mansion, not a poor fisherman. Ethan looked up, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. "What is this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Without saying a word, Ethan pushed the gate open, revealing the grand compound inside. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight before her. The house was beyond anything she had ever imagined, huge, with tall trees surrounding it, golden lanterns casting a soft glow in the fading light. It looked like something from a fairy tale, a life she had never even dreamed of. "This is my home," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been keeping this from you because I wanted to know if you love me for who I am, not for what I have." Emily's world tilted on its axis. The man she had married, the man she had believed to be poor, was standing before her in a mansion, living a life she had never known existed. She felt dizzy, unsure of what to believe. How could he have kept this from her? Why had he made her believe he was just a poor fisherman? Ethan seemed to sense her confusion and stepped closer. "I never wanted anyone to love me for my wealth," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "I needed to know if someone would love me for the person I am, not for the things I could give them." Emily's mind raced as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. Ethan's kindness, his quiet strength, it had all been real. But so had his wealth. He hadn't been a poor man at all. He had been testing her. And for the first time, Emily realized that the man she had been forced to marry had never been the man the world thought he was. Her emotions were a whirlwind: shock, betrayal, confusion, and something else, something deep and buried. Ethan had never told her the truth, but his love for her had always been real. And as she stood there, surrounded by a world she had never known, she couldn't help but wonder, could she ever forgive him for keeping this secret? Would she be able to move forward, knowing that everything she had believed about him had been a lie? In the days that followed, Emily wrestled with her emotions. The shock of Ethan's secret had shaken her to her core, and she was torn between the love she had slowly come to feel for him and the betrayal of the truth he had hidden from her. But as she spent more time reflecting, she realized that Ethan's actions had always shown kindness and care, qualities that no amount of wealth could create. It wasn't the mansion or the riches that mattered, it was the quiet moments of empathy, the understanding in his eyes, and the way he had always treated her with respect and tenderness, even when he had nothing. One evening, as the sun set over the grand estate, Emily found herself sitting by the river, contemplating everything she had learned. Ethan approached her, his footsteps soft in the grass, and sat beside her. Without a word, he reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. Emily turned to him, her heart still heavy with unanswered questions. But this time, she looked at him with new eyes. For the first time in her life, She felt truly seen. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have told you sooner. I never wanted to hurt you." Emily squeezed his hand, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I know," she replied softly, "but now, I know who you are. And I think, in the end, that's all that matters." The night fell silent around them. And in that moment, Emily realized that she had finally found the peace she had been searching for. Love wasn't about wealth or status, it was about understanding, trust, and the courage to be vulnerable. And with Ethan, she had found all of that. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories and heartfelt tales.